Zoom chat, and then I will either direct it to the organizers or directly reply to you. Would that be okay? If you have any other questions?
지금부터 국가 온실가스 감축 목표 국제 웨비나를 시작하도록 하겠습니다.
We will now begin the International NDCs webinar. Today we will be hearing about the 2030 NDCs of major countries, and we will also be hearing about Korea's NDCs increase, and we will like to draw implications from the cases of overseas and Korea. Today's webinar is being hosted by the Energy Transition Forum Korea, and it is being sponsored by the Presidential Committee on Carbon Neutrality 2050. First, I would like to introduce the speakers and the moderator. Being recorded. We have Dr. Brian Motherway, Head of Energy Efficiency at IEA, and Mr. Simon Petrie, Head of International Climate Strategy, Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy from the UK, and Mrs. Diana Nissler, Ministry of Environment from Germany, and Dr. Kentaro Tamura, Program Director of Climate and Energy Institute for Global Environmental Strategies. Dr. Miles Perry, Economist of the European Commission. And we have two speakers who could not join in person due to the time difference. We have two speakers who have sent their recorded messages. Dr. Rick Duke, Senior Advisor of the State Department of the United States, and we have Mr. Douglas Nevison, Assistant Deputy Minister of the Climate Change Canada. And now I will be introducing the moderator. In the second part of today's session, we have Professor Byung An of Hoseo University. Professor An was a former Vice Minister of the Ministry of Environment. And for our discussants, we have Lee Chang-hoon, Senior Researcher Fellow at Korea Environment Institute, and Eun-mi Chung from Korea Institute for Industrial Economics and Trade, and Sung-ho Lee from Korea Institute of Energy Technology Evaluation and Planning, and from Solutions for Our Environment, Joo-jin Kim, for Our Climate, Joo-jin Kim, and Eun-bin Kang from Youth Climate Emergency Action. We will now hear the opening address and congratulatory remarks which will be provided by Chair of the Energy Transition Korea Forum, Sun Jin-yoon. Hello everyone, as was introduced, I am Chair Sun Jin-yoon of Energy Transition Forum Korea. Dr. Brian Motherway, Head of Energy Efficiency, Mr. Simon Petrie, Head of International Climate Strategy, Mrs. Diana Nissler, Dr. Kentaro Tamura, Dr. Miles Perry, and thank you for your participation. And it is my great pleasure to be delivering this congratulatory remark in the International NDCs webinar. This day and age is an era of a climate crisis. We are seeing abnormal weather patterns and pandemics such as COVID-19. We are seeing news and hear about news about such pandemics and crises. Since the Industrial Revolution, we have put our priority on economic development, and this has led to a high carbon producing economy, and this is not sustainable anymore. And for the current generation and for future generations' survival, governments, private sector, civil society, and everyone in our society must take action, and we must take preemptive actions immediately. Korea is no exception. Climate change is a crisis for people of Korea and Korea. And last year, we have set a national target of net zero by 2050. And in order to realize net zero by 2050, we are studying various scenarios. And with the Paris Accord, we are seeing a lot of efforts in order to address climate change. And through the Paris Accord, the world is trying to reduce the global warming by 2 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels, and to further reduce that. The Kyoto Protocol was only for certain countries, but for the Paris Accord, it applies to all countries, and all countries must submit their NDCs. And it is requiring universal effort to address climate change. And in various countries, they have committed to net zero by 2050, and many countries are revising and strengthening their NDCs. During the climate summit, Korea also has increased its NDC from 24% to strengthen this. And during the May US-Korea summit, have stated that it will increase its commitments and that there will be a 2030 NDC that has been strengthened by the next UN FCCC meeting. And NDC is a midway strategy target to achieve net zero by 2050, and it is an effort required to have sustainable development, and Korea will be participating. In particular, the 2050 Committee on Carbon Neutrality will work on developing our 2030 NDC, and we will do a thorough review in order for Korea to truly realize carbon neutrality by 2050, and our efforts will be continuing. Climate change is no longer a choice. It is become an irreversible trend that all countries must address and work on. We have leading countries in addressing climate change, such as UK, Germany, EU, Japan, United States, and Canada, and they are participating on offline, and I'm sure that our discussions will lead to fruitful discussions in order to achieve 2050 carbon neutrality, and also in devising NDCs that lead to this realization. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that congratulatory remarks. Moving on, we would like to start the presentation session from IEA. We have learned that realizing net zero by 2050 is important, but what is more important is the roadmap to that 2050 net zero. So we're going to learn about the roadmap, different roadmaps available for net zero 2050, and also the available policy mechanisms. For that topic, we have Dr. Brian Motherway from IEA.
Hello, and thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I hope you can hear me okay. And I am grateful that you have given me the opportunity to join you this morning here in Paris, and it's a pleasure to be with you in the afternoon in Seoul. I'm going to show you a few slides, if I may, so I shall share my screen now. So I hope you can see my screen. As the chair kindly said, we in the IEA have been working to analyze what a roadmap might look like for net zero emissions of the global energy system between now and 2050. And while we often talk about 2050 as an endpoint, it's very important that we also discuss the start point. Where are we today, and what action do we need to take first to get us on that road towards net zero emissions by 2050? And of course, we are talking in the context of a global crisis which has affected people's lives in very many ways, and of course has really affected the global economy. And last year we saw global emissions drop to a historic level because of the negative impacts of COVID on the global economy. And of course, the question then as we try to recover from COVID and we try to rebuild our economies is, what is the pathway for our carbon emissions as we recover? Can we put ourselves on a sustainable pathway towards lower emissions, or is there a danger of emissions rebounding as economies start to recover? I have to tell you that the early signals are not positive. Here in 2021, we see a strong rebounding of both energy demand and global carbon emissions from the energy system. Already, we see some countries growing to beyond their emissions of 2019, and we expect the whole economy of the world to do that if something doesn't change. In fact, just 1 hour ago this morning here in Paris, we launched a new sustainable recovery tracker analysis that shows that of the countries investing in economic recovery from COVID, only a very small proportion of that money is being put into low carbon and clean energy investment. And so far, we are not seeing the kind of investment or policy action required to put us on a decarbonized pathway for the energy system. In fact, we are seeing the exact opposite. In that context, we published our global pathway to 2050 net zero. I always stress that this is a pathway. Countries will choose their own directions of travel and their own preferred technologies, policies, and actions. But this pathway shows the kind of actions that will be required for the global economy to reach net zero by 2050. And it reminds us in particular that there are many milestones in all sectors of the economy along the way. Particularly in this decade of 2020 to 2030, we must realize that the time to act is now, and that very strong policy action and increased investment is required in all sectors if we are to have a chance to get ourselves on the path towards net zero by 2050. Some key areas for this decade, 2020 to 2030, we need to see wind and solar deployment grow by a factor of 4. Even though they have been growing very strongly in recent years in all parts of the world, we need to see that grow even more. We need to see electric car sales grow by a factor of 18 in this decade. And we need to see the global intensity of the energy economy reduced by 4% every year in 2020 to 2030. I can tell you that's about 3 times the recent performance of intensity improvements. So again, it shows that a very significant step up is required. Of course, this will be driven by investment, and we see a huge step up in clean energy investment across this decade, more than a quadrupling in all parts of the clean energy economy, but of course a particular focus on NDCs, whether that's retrofitting buildings, upgrading industrial energy efficiency, and of course electric vehicles, other aspects of transport. It should be remembered that this increased investment is an opportunity for the globe. It drives an increase in global GDP, it creates new jobs, it stimulates economies. So there's a real opportunity for economic stimulus in the short term to be well aligned with our medium and long-term goals for decarbonization and to create win-win situations across economies and societies. In particular, we know that there will be some job losses in a clean energy future, particularly in certain sectors such as coal, oil and gas. But according to the IEA's analysis, we will create many millions more jobs than are lost in a clean energy economy. We will create literally tens of millions of jobs, many of them high-skilled jobs. Of course, it's worth acknowledging that those jobs won't always be in the same places, for the same skill sets, for the same people. So the job impacts of clean energy transitions are a very sensitive and important topic for governments to address, and I will return to that topic in a couple of minutes. It's worth noting as well that energy security, which is of course is at the heart of the IEA's mission and is a key priority for all governments, remains a key issue in clean energy context. But some of the issues pertaining to energy security change, whether it's where we get our oil from, whether it's our dependence on critical minerals, whether it's the changing nature of our electricity systems. All of these considerations need policy attention and need prioritization so that we understand how to maintain high levels of energy security as we proceed through clean energy transitions. Energy efficiency, of course, is a key focus, particularly a key early focus, because it's an opportunity to stimulate economies, to create jobs, to mobilize workforces and investment in areas such as building new efficient buildings, retrofitting existing buildings, upgrading industrial and business premises. There are many opportunities to act quickly in energy efficiency, which of course reduces the overall size of the future energy system, constrains demand, and allows for other clean energy actions to become more feasible and more affordable in the future. So it remains a key priority focus, particularly in the early phase of clean energy transitions. And that's why, of course, we hope to see a very large increase in investment in energy efficiency in the coming years. These are different scenarios coming for the second half of this decade, but they all show a very significant step up in energy efficiency investment in the second half of this decade, in some cases very substantial indeed, particularly on the right-hand side where we see the net zero energy scenario and the need to drive investment in all parts of clean energy, but particularly in energy efficiency in the early phase. In that regard, I just want to mention some of the work we're doing in the IEA with many governments represented here today, and we're particularly grateful for the support of the UK government, with whom we are working very closely in the context of COP26 on the super efficient equipment and appliances deployment initiative. This is a global movement of governments, companies, and international organizations to really drive higher ambition for key energy using products to make sure they are much more efficient as quickly as possible. Across electric motor systems, air conditioners, refrigerators, and lighting, which between them use more than half of the world's electricity demand, there is an opportunity to literally double their efficiency between now and 2030, driven by new technology, driven by stronger policy, driven by regulation and incentives. And members, governments around the world are now working together to see how we can drive higher ambition through harmonized ways of thinking about efficiency, harmonized measurement techniques, and much stronger policy action. And I'm pleased to say that recently the G7 leaders endorsed this ambition in their final communique in the UK just a few weeks ago. We are keen to work with all governments on this initiative as we build momentum towards COP26 so that we can raise global ambition on energy efficiency in key areas. I would also stress that the way we think about electricity and energy efficiency and clean energy are changing very rapidly. Gone are the days where we think about supply totally separate to demand, and we think about a very passive system enabled by digitalization and driven by the penetration of variable renewable resources. We are now seeing the emergence of much more dynamic, interconnected electricity systems where supply and demand interplay in much more complicated and flexible ways. And in particular, flexibility on the demand side becomes crucial to optimizing the use of clean resources when they're available, such as solar and wind, and therefore for reducing the overall investment needs for electricity, reducing the cost of electricity systems, and making electricity cleaner and cheaper for all users. This is a major focus of attention for many governments, and we are pleased to be working with governments around the world, particularly through an initiative we called Digital Demand-Driven Energy Networks, 3DEN, which is led by the government of Italy in the context of its G20 presidency. And just later this week, we will publish at the G20 Energy Ministerial meeting a new analysis of smart cities and smart grids and the policy opportunities for governments to enable stronger investment and stronger action by using digital technologies to make grids more dynamic, more flexible, and ultimately more cleaner, more resilient and reliable, and better for consumers and societies as a whole. In all of these issues, I want to stress before I close that all aspects that I spoke about today focus on people. It's worth remembering that clean energy transitions are about making people's lives better, bringing the benefits of clean energy to everybody in the world, limiting the negative impacts of climate change, and building a future energy system where clean, affordable, and reliable energy is freely accessible to all. In that context, we must keep a focus on people in our clean energy transitions, and we must also recognize that if people don't support and participate in clean energy transitions, they will not succeed. For that reason, earlier this year, our Executive Director, Dr. Fatih Birol, convened the Global Commission on People-Centered Clean Energy Transitions, which brings together energy and climate ministers and other leading thinkers from every part of the world to work together to understand how clean energy transitions can be equitable, inclusive, and people-centered. The Commission is working as we speak to make recommendations which will be published later this year in advance of COP26 and will focus on actionable recommendations for governments to understand how to ensure that clean energy transitions create many new quality jobs for their citizens, how those who might lose their jobs can be protected at the individual and community level. It will also explore best practice in areas such as ensuring that clean energy can enhance social and economic development, that equity and inclusion can be protected, that clean energy transitions go hand in hand with key issues such as gender equity, social inclusion and empowerment, and of course how people can be active participants in clean energy transitions in ways such as showing public support and of course in their own behaviour. And later today here at the IEA we will be hosting a webinar looking at best practice in the design of behaviour change policies for clean energy to encourage citizens and consumers to behave in ways that are more efficient, more clean and more on the pathway towards net zero energy. So Chair, colleagues, thank you very much for allowing me to speak today. I hope my remarks have helped set the context for this discussion. It's really exciting to see the focus here on NDCs at this time. It's really exciting to hear the great work going on in Korea and with all of the partners globally. And I want to stress that the IEA is your willing and determined partner, and we look forward to working with you on these issues in the months and years ahead. Thank you very much, Chair.
네, 닥터 브레인 모더웨이 국제에너지기구 에너지효율국 국장님.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brian Motherway, Head of Energy Efficiency, for your great presentation. So the process of achieving net zero is not just tough. It will lead to job creation and it can contributing in adding efficiency to our society. We will go on to the next presentation. The next presentation will be delivered by Mr. Simon Petrie, Head of International Climate Strategy Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And the UK has announced that their NDC by 2030 is 68%, and by 2035 it will be 75%, and they have carbon budgets to achieve this. We will now hear from Mr. Simon Petrie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, everybody in South Korea. Good morning, everybody in my part of the world. I am delighted to be here with you today. Thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be on the panel with the other distinguished speakers. Thanks in particular to Brian from the IEA for giving us that very helpful introduction, and we congratulate the IEA on their roadmap work, their pathways work, and I'll say a little bit more in a moment about the UK's own plans for its 2050 pathway, and some really helpful examples from Brian about the scale of the challenge that we faced. So I work for the UK government in our business and energy department, which is where we bring together energy and climate change. And at the moment, a lot of us working very hard, as you would expect, on preparations for COP26 in Glasgow in November. And I led the team that came up with the UK's own nationally determined contribution last December and worked across government on that. And this morning, this afternoon for you, I would like to say a bit about why NDCs matter, how we came up with the UK's NDC and what it says, and then how we are going to deliver on it. And I hope those three things will be useful. Next slide, please. And again, please. So I think it is worth pausing on where NDCs come from, why all countries are trying to announce the most ambitious NDCs possible. And of course, for that, we need to look at the historic agreement that was reached in Paris in 2015. And I should say, the text you can see on the screen is text that we looked at a lot when coming up with the UK's own nationally determined contribution. And it was the main factor influencing how we decided on the UK's 68% target. And it's worth pausing on just a couple of aspects of this. I know you'll be familiar with it, but we certainly spent a lot of time scrutinising this in the UK. Of course, it's driven by the temperature goal, which has already been spoken about. But when the Paris Agreement comes to talk about nationally determined contributions, I think some of the key phrases are underlined here in the middle, that each nationally determined contribution a country comes out with must represent a step up from the one before, and that the nationally determined contribution must represent highest possible ambition, noting that that will be different for different countries as per the Paris Agreement. And I think highest possible are words that we came back to again and again in the UK. And it really did feel like when we set our NDC, we were stretching the boundaries of what is possible. And when we set it, we didn't have a 100% perfect bulletproof plan for exactly how we're going to meet it, but we were confident we could. And now the work starts to make that a reality, and I'll talk more about that later. Just quickly on timing too. So again, the Paris Agreement sets this timeline for NDCs every 5 years, starting at the end of 2020, and that is why the UK announced its NDC at the end of 2020. Although, of course, we recognise that the COVID pandemic changed some countries' plans. But the UN, as part of the UNFCCC process, has also asked countries to come forward well ahead of the relevant COP. For us, that's of course COP26 in November. And as COP presidency, we are still pushing hard for countries that haven't yet come forward to come forward with their NDC. So it was great to hear South Korean plans to announce their increased NDC before COP26. Next slide, please. You will all be familiar with this chart, but it is worth reminding ourselves of the scale of the challenge. This graph was made before, it doesn't take account of some of the most recent NDC announcements, but even if it did, it wouldn't look very different. And the headline is, based on current NDCs we have and those we expect to get, we are collectively still a long way from meeting 2 degrees C, let alone 1.5 degrees. So the challenge is vast. Next, please. That is why the UK, in its presidency of COP26, has made mitigation, that's reducing emissions, one of its top 4 goals. I've highlighted that blue here. The other goals, adaptation, finance, and collaboration, are of course very important. But at the heart of it is the mitigation goal. And that is about global net zero to keep that Paris temperature goal alive. And specifically then, what we are working with countries around the world to try and agree are net zero commitments by mid-century, and we heard earlier about South Korea's own commitment there. But more specifically, and more in some ways more importantly, what are the plans over the next decade now to 2030 to put us on that path to 2050? You could say, in some ways, it's quite easy to make projections and targets for 2050, however hard they are. But for politicians, ministers, governments, that's a long way off. Many of us will be retired by then. It's much harder to make realistic commitments for the near term, the next 10 years. And we know the next 10 years are make or break. Next, please. So this summarizes the state of play on NDCs. So on the left there, yes, more countries have come forward with NDCs over the past year ahead of COP, and more countries have made net zero commitments, including quite recently the G7, which was again in the UK, where the G7 countries committed to net zero by 2050 together. But, and there's a big but, further progress is still needed. And indeed, the sooner that can come ahead of COP, the better. Because we've seen with the UK's own NDC and others that came early, the sort of domino effect that it has on persuading other countries to announce their own NDCs. And I think as well as the targets themselves, as Brian was saying, the next step will be to have clear plans that make those targets come alive, that our populations and other countries believe that it's credible for us to get there by 2030. And so we can't just have targets, we also need to see the policies that will be in place to deliver on those. And as Brian mentioned as well, there is an opportunity presented by the COVID crisis, and a choice for all governments about how we respond. Do we take the opportunity to change our economies and make some big dramatic changes that are necessary to meet the goals of Paris, or do we take the easier option and revert to business as usual, which would certainly mean 1.5 is out of reach. And finally, my point at the bottom here on the right, even when countries have made ambitious NDC commitments, it doesn't stop there. We believe there's a responsibility for all countries then to work with others, support them and help them come up with their own pledges, and to put those targets into law and to show how they will be implemented. Next, please. Okay, so now a bit about how we decided on the UK's NDC and the process we went through and what it says. Next, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in the UK, the Climate Change Act from 2008 sets the direction for everything we do on climate change and all of our targets. Now, initially, that Climate Change Act said that we would reduce emissions by 80% by 2050. But in response to IPCC reports, the Paris Agreement, etc., we changed that legal target so that now it's net zero by 2050 in law, which means that on 1990 levels, by 2050, it is a legal requirement to reduce emissions by 100% if you net those off against any sinks that you may have. The Act also does something very important for us in the UK. So as well as having that headline net zero target by 2050, it requires the government to set carbon budgets for every 5 years, a long time in advance, so 12 years in advance, to be on that pathway to net zero. And just for reference, before we made our NDC, our original carbon budget 5, which covers the 2030 period, said that we'd reduce emissions by 57%. So when we came out with our NDC, we increased from 57 effectively to 68. The other key part of this, which is essential for progress in the UK, is the Climate Change Committee. So that is an independent group of experts that sit outside government, that are accountable to Parliament, that tell the government how it's doing on its climate targets, and advises us on what level the different carbon budgets need to be. And it's a healthy but sometimes tense relationship. And even recently, you may have seen that there was a lot of news in the UK because the CCC, the Climate Change Committee, had come out and said the government is not on track to meet net zero by 2050, and we're not on track to meet some of our future carbon budgets. And now it's the government's responsibility to respond to Parliament on how we will do that. Next, please. Here, I've tried to show the most important factors that we took into account when deciding what the UK's NDC should be, what the number should be. So starting from the top and following the arrows, we've talked about the Paris Agreement temperature goal, limiting temperatures to 1.5 degrees or pursuing efforts to that effect. We also thought carefully about what's called fair share and the equity principles also enshrined in the Paris Agreement. So recognising that different countries have different responsibilities. And for that, we looked at the IPCC's pathways to net zero by 2050 and considered where the UK needed to be on that trajectory compared with other countries and what was fair, taking account of our previous emissions and our responsibility and our capability to reduce. The next bubble, I've talked about net zero, talked about carbon budget 5, which was a sort of a starting point, which was 57% reduction by 2030. But we also had our earlier NDC when we were part of the EU. We may hear more about that later because that's obviously now been increased. But when we were looking at our UK NDC, the EU's NDC was 40%, a 40% reduction by 2030. And for the UK, that worked out at about 53%. So we needed to increase beyond 53% and beyond the 57% that was in our carbon budget 5. I've mentioned the advice from the Climate Change Committee. We also ran a very extensive process across government to share the challenge. You know, we have to come out with a new NDC. We're COP26 presidents. It needs to be net zero compatible. If we don't go high, other countries may think it's an excuse to go low. So there was quite a robust process with cabinet committees, with all the senior ministers in the UK government, sat round a table saying which department, transport, buildings, heat, energy efficiency, forests and land use, how much can you reduce emissions by 2030? What is the highest possible you can do? And the Prime Minister himself chairs some of those cabinet committees. So it was a whole of government affair with the Treasury involved as well. And if it hadn't been all of government, we wouldn't have agreed that NDC because my department, BEIS, can't do everything. And finally, the last bubble that I think is really important, we had lots of discussions with NGOs, campaign groups, businesses, and other countries to understand what they were expecting from the UK, what they think highest possible looked like. And I should say, certainly with civil society, we didn't please everybody. Some argued that we should go further, but because we'd taken time to explain our process and the limitations and the opportunities, I think most understood where we'd come out and recognise it is still a very significant shift. Next, please. So this is just some detail of what's in the UK's NDC. I won't go through all of it. The headline target at the top, the CCC advice. Very importantly, alongside the NDC, of course, all countries are expected to produce information to facilitate clarity, transparency and understanding. That's the document that sets out how we set our target, what numbers and assumptions and modelling is underneath it, and how it meets Paris expectations. And there's some more detail there about the decisions we made about what was in and what was out. But importantly, it was all economy and all greenhouse gases and a single number, which is best practice. And alongside that, of course, we had our communications on adaptation and finance as well. Next, please. So how are we going to deliver on this? Next, please. So the UK has done well up to now, and we use this slide often to show how we've managed to decouple emissions reduction from emissions reduction from GDP and growth, economic growth. But to some extent, the easier reductions have been made, and it just gets harder from now. Next slide, please. So this chart shows our current 5 carbon budgets. Since then, we've legislated for our 6th, which raises the bar again to a 78% reduction by 2035. And the CCC, the Committee on Climate Change, has been quite open about how, at the moment, we are not on track to meet carbon budget 4 and 5. And they've made recommendations about what we need to do. And now the government is in the process of considering how to respond and what we should do. So I just want to pick through some of our key policies that are recent and that are coming to demonstrate how we will deliver. Next, please. This just shows the split of emissions across the UK, similar to some of the charts that Brian showed. Next, please. So in November, the Prime Minister came out with these 10 key points covering lots of sectors of the economy about where we would make changes. And since then, if you go to the next slide, please. Since then, we've come out with a series of policy statements covering energy, so how we will transform the energy sector, covering transport most recently, including our pledge to phase out electric vehicles, to phase out petrol and diesel vehicles by 2030, and with more to come. Perhaps we could just skip through the next couple of slides, please. So yeah, that was about the industrial decarbonisation strategy, is how we will reduce emissions in the industrial sector. The transport decarbonisation plan came out very recently, including a consultation on what we've called Jet Zero, how to reduce emissions to net zero in the aviation sector, maritime and rail. Next slide, please. And again, please, next slide. And the final slide, please. So building on those plans that we've just shown you, we are also, before COP26, going to publish our own UK net zero strategy, which will bring together all of the work across the sectors, a bit like Brian's work for the IEA did, showing how we will get to net zero by 2050. And we will do that ahead of COP26. And that will also form the basis of our long-term strategy to the UNFCCC. I will stop because I think I've gone over time. Thank you. I've left on here my details on the next slide if anyone has any follow-up questions, but I hope that was helpful. Thanks.
네, 내용을 꼼꼼하게 소개해 주세요.
Yes, thank you very much for that thorough presentation. Once again, thank you very much, Mr. Simon Petrie. And it's unfortunate that we had to limit your presentation time, because more time would have allowed you to deliver to us more information. So that was unfortunate that we only had limited amount of time. Now we would like to move on to our third presentation. The third presentation is going to be delivered by Ms. Diana Nissler from the Ministry of Environment in Germany. After the Constitutional Court decision, now Germany decided to raise its NDC to 65% by 2030, and also realize net zero by 2045. So, Specialist Diana Nissler, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to speak at your webinar and share with you the latest developments regarding Germany's climate target. My name is Diana Nissler. I'm a desk officer at the Ministry of Environment in the unit for climate action planning and climate action program, which is responsible for the German climate strategy, including targets and measures. During the next 15 minutes, I'll talk to you about the new targets and how they involved. I'll share some details about the climate governance in Germany. And finally, we'll have a look at our program of measures. Let's start to the next slide, please. The Federal Climate Act in Germany was originally drafted in 2019, and it contained basically 3 categories of targets. We had the ultimate target to achieve greenhouse gas neutrality by 2050. We had an overall mitigation target for 2030, and we defined individual sector targets for energy, transport, building, industry, agriculture, and waste sectors, for each year between 2020 and 2030. The 29th of April was, for the German climate policy, quite a decisive day, because on that day the Federal Constitutional Court published a ruling where it criticized that the Act does not spell out the emission pathway after the year 2031. And they concluded that this might postpone the burden for reducing emissions to future generations, which would pose a threat to the freedom of these younger generations. So consequently, the federal government was ordered to revise the targets and revise the Federal Climate Act. Next slide, please. That's then what the government decided to do without delay. So in May and June, we were coming up with new targets and a new mitigation trajectory. The new elements of our mitigation trajectory, that's what you see here on this slide in green. So as you can see, overall, the climate targets became more ambitious. Additional targets have been included. And the pathway to climate neutrality this way became more explicit than it has been before. Why did Germany decide to increase its ambition this way? I think there's several aspects that are worth mentioning here. One is the ruling of the Federal Constitutional Court that I already mentioned, but there's also a general public pressure to become more ambitious with regard to climate change. Another aspect was to deliver a just contribution to the recently increased EU NDC. And another factor is that Germany is an export-oriented economy, and a growing number of our trading partners aim at greenhouse gas neutrality themselves. So an ambitious transition of our economy to greenhouse gas neutrality is, of course, our contribution to fight global warming, but it's also a strategy to remain competitive and secure a prosperous economy in the long run. Next slide, please. Here you can see what these new targets mean regarding stepping up our ambition. You see the historic emissions on the left side and our new emission trajectory on the right side. So basically these targets means we considerably have to step up our average annual mitigation rate compared to the previous decades. Next slide, please. Now let's take a look at the individual sector targets. You can see here on this slide that the reduction rate between sectors differs quite a bit. The sector targets have been fixed based on the mitigation potential of the individual sectors and how fast this potential can be realized. The data were based on an integrated greenhouse gas mitigation scenario that included all these sectors and also meets the overall mitigation targets in 2030 and achieves greenhouse gas neutrality by 2045. It's quite evident that energy and industry contribute the largest share in the aspired mitigation effort. As mentioned by Brian Motherway from the International Energy Agency, the energy sector offers decarbonization options at competitive costs. And low carbon energy sector is also important for decarbonizing not only the industry, but also the housing and transport sectors. In comparison to that, the mitigation pathway in building and transport is also steady, but considerably slower. With the agricultural sector, here it is difficult to realize additional mitigation potential in the short term because this depends to a considerable degree, at least in Germany, on the livestock numbers. Next slide, please. The annual sector targets that I just showed to you are basically the backbone of our mitigation trajectory. And we installed an annual monitoring procedure to make sure that we stay in line of these sector budgets or sector targets. So each year, the sector targets are checked against the actual emission data. And in case a budget should be exceeded, the ministry in charge is then required to draft an immediate program of action. This program of action is then considered and decided upon by the federal cabinet. That's the process you can see on this chart. Let's move on to the next slide. There is, of course, not just the immediate action programs, but also a regular climate action program. It includes the measures that are required to achieve our medium-term targets. The current climate action program has been agreed in October 2019. And it's valid until 2030, or describes the measures to be realized to meet the 2030 targets, to be more precise. And obviously, with our new climate targets from the revised Federal Climate Act and the EU Fit for 55 package, this current climate action program is up for revision. The requirements for updating and setting up the climate action program are also defined by the Federal Climate Act, and you can see some of these requirements here on the slide. Let's move to the final slide, please. However, even though the program is not entirely up to date, to give you a better impression of the climate action program, I copied the structure and a few selected measures on the slide. It's basically structured around the sectors. Each sector has an individual chapter. And in addition to that, there's chapters on CO2 pricing for heating and transport, because this has been a cross-sector measure that has been newly introduced with the last climate action program. It also contains a dedicated chapter that describes measures to alleviate burdens for citizens and society, and citizens and industry. And it includes a chapter on cross-sector measures that target emissions in several sectors at the same time. I provide an example how closely our national measures and the EU framework are intertwined. For example, one measure in the energy sector has been the phase out of coal-fired power plants in Germany. According to the current decision, coal-fired power plants should be phased out until 2038. But now with the more ambitious cap that has been proposed by the EU Commission for the European Emission Trading System, we assume that the phase out of coal-fired power plants will be speeded up and will happen earlier than previously envisaged. You can further see that our program of measures consists of different types of instruments, mostly fiscal, economic, and regulatory measures. So with this program and with our overall climate policy, we aim at a transition towards a sustainable greenhouse gas neutral economy and society that also preserves the rich biodiversity. And the EU Green Deal, with the revision of its 44 EU directives and regulatory measures, will also provide further support for us to meet these objectives. A key component that has also been mentioned by Brian Motherway and Simon Petrie before is a just transition. Also for Germany, that's a key objective in our climate policy. We want to make sure no one is left behind. And we, of course, do consider the social impacts of climate policies. Also, public consultation processes, stakeholder consultations, are an integrated part in the evolution of our climate strategy and the climate action programs. So, final slide, please. So, I hope you found this brief overview on the German climate targets and policies useful for your further work on the Korean NDC. And I invite you to get in touch if you would like to get further information on any aspect of this presentation. Thank you very much.
Miss Diana Nissler.
Thank you, Ms. Diana Nissler, for your great presentation. We heard about the increased NDC targets of Germany and also about the generation targets. Next, we will go on to the next presentation. We will be hearing from Dr. Kentaro Tamura, Program Director of Climate and Energy Institute for Global Environmental Strategies. Dr. Kentaro will be speaking about Japan's strategy and plan.
Okay, thank you very much. This is Kentaro Tamura from IGES, Global Environmental Strategy, Japan. It is my great pleasure to speak at this important event, International NDC Seminar, and I would like to express my sincere thanks to the British Embassy Seoul and Energy Transition Forum and the 2050 Carbon Neutrality Commission for inviting me. Yeah, today I'd like to speak about some. Sorry. I just to use. There is a point. Sorry. Okay. Oh, sorry. Yep. Yeah, today I'd like to speak about Japan's new emission reduction target. My presentation consists of mainly three parts. First, I will briefly set out Japan's emission reduction ambition in terms of 2030 target and 2050 target. The second, I will explain changes in the policy process for raising the emission reduction ambition for 2030 target, and also driving force behind such changes. Then finally, I will explain some current status of the domestic discussion over how to achieve the new 2030 target and also any possible measures required to achieve Japan's new target. Then, okay, so this figure shows the historical trend of Japan GHG greenhouse gas emission and also previous emission reduction target. As you can see, previously Japan pledged to reduce its emission by 26% against 2030 level by 2030. And also this target are now currently communicated as Japan's NDC, National Determined Contribution. And Japan also set two long-term goals. One is 80% reduction by 2050, even though its base year is not clear. The other one is to achieve net zero as early as possible in the second half of this century. These two long-term goals are stipulated in Japan's long-term strategy under the Paris Agreement. So these are all the previous goal or target. Then Japan has raised its climate ambition by declaring 2030 new target and also 2050 target. So last October, Prime Minister Suga, in his first policy speech in the Diet, he declared that Japan would achieve carbon neutrality or net zero emission by 2050. It was a big surprise, but a really welcome surprise to me. And also, in this April, at Climate Leaders Summit organized by US administration, Prime Minister also declared a new 2030 target. That means to reduce emission by 46% by 2030, and also make some effort to meet lofty goal of 50%. So these are new target. So the basis for this 46% reduction target is not known. There are various assessment of this target in terms of consistency with 1.5 degree goal. But at the bottom line, if a straight line will be drawn from 2013 level to 2050 level, this 46 level is on the line, on this straight line. So this is kind of a basis, I guess, for this 2030 target. So in parallel with this development of emission reduction target, there are interesting changes in the policy making process in Japan. That means the acceleration and also changes in the policy process. So what I called the shift from energy target first approach to climate target first approach. That means initially energy policy or energy target provided framework within which climate target was set. So actually when Japanese government set its current NDC, that is 26% reduction target, so energy basic plan or strategic energy plan, which provided basic framework of energy policy in 2 decades. So this strategic energy plan provided macroeconomic framework and also energy mix for 2030. So which in turn basis for calculation for this emission reduction target. So this is an initial kind of a policy setting or process for formulating climate target. So based upon this process, we initially expected that new climate target, that means new 2030 target, would be set after the revision of current strategic energy plan. And also to this strategic energy plan is now under the revision, and also we expect it revised in this summer. So new target will be set sometime in autumn and before to COP26. This is a kind of the initial thought about this Japan situation. But situation has completely changed. That means now the government took some climate target first approach. So as I said, last October, Prime Minister Suga declared that carbon neutrality by 2050, and also this April, he also pledged a new 2030 target before revision of strategic energy policy. That means now strategic energy policy or energy policy is expected to provide basis for this 26% reduction target and also to 2050 carbon neutrality. So as I said now, climate policy set the framework within which energy policy are discussed. So this is a new situation. At this moment, we don't know to what extent this process will be institutionalized, but at least for this moment, the situation, that process has changed. And also, I'd like to explain the two set of driving forces behind these changes. So one set is come from international pressure, especially from the US and the UK. So initially, actually at the beginning of this year, we expect the new target will come sometime in October. In autumn. But after the Biden administration took power, this March, Japan-US foreign minister meeting held. At that meeting, Secretary Blinken, he emphasized we do more on decarbonization before climate leaders summit. That means not before COP26. This is come from the US pressure. And also 1 month later, in April, mid-April, Japan-US summit meeting held. Then both countries committed 1.5 degree target and also achieved 2030 target that are compatible with 2050 net zero emission. So this is another pressure for rising 2030 target. Then at almost the same time, COP26 President Alok Sharma, he also visited Japan, and he emphasized that around 50% is valid for Japan. So this kind of international pressure that gathered around this time. The other set of pressure came from the domestic front, especially the business. Initially, the business sector, they used to see the climate policy as kind of cost. But due to Paris Agreement and also actual climate impact, which hit in Japan and all over the world, they started to change their perception. Then now they said climate change is real, and also climate change is a threat to the society, the risk to their business operation. Then some of the business sector started to take more pro-climate action, and especially Japan Climate Leaders Partnership, JCLP. This is a coalition of around 200 companies with total electricity consumption around 60 terawatt hour. This is 6% of total Japan's electricity generation. So 6% is not that big, but not that small. But this certain number of the business they urged that a more ambitious target and 50% reduction and above. And also another network, this is a more loose network of around 500 companies and other local authorities. They also request ambitious target at 45% or around 60%. So because of this international and domestic pressure, Japanese government took kind of decision to set 46% reduction by 2050. These are two international kind of driving forces behind Japan's climate ambition. But these numbers, 46% or even 50%, is not that easy, of course. So as I said, currently there's a new strategic energy plan under discussion. And also this figure show here the historical trend of power generation in Japan. So as you can see, this bottom is nuclear. After that Fukushima accident, the portion or rate of nuclear is very low. But on the other hand, linear energy rapidly increased. But still, in 2019, this carbon-free electricity accounts for around 24% of total generation. Then, for the current strategic energy plan, they stipulated some 2030 energy mix on this one. So current 26% reduction target based upon these numbers. But now, as I said, 46% reduction target provides some framework under which this energy policy or energy mix should be considered. Then now there are hot discussion regarding this the energy mix. Or, for example, what could be the total energy generation, and how much is the share of thermal power reduced, and to what extent renewable energy capacity can be increased, and also so share of the nuclear remains same or not. So by the way, this 20 or 22% share of the nuclear is to me unrealistically high ambition. So, but still, to meet the 26% reduction, it is reported that the now government also decide the share of nuclear remain the same. But interestingly, tomorrow the new draft of this revised energy mix will be released. So maybe tomorrow we can see what the new the figures for this energy mix. So, but the bottom, so there are huge hot discussion regarding how to achieve this 46% reduction. But two key message can be drawn. So one is obviously we need further effort to increase carbon-free electricity, but of course there are some constraints, especially for the nuclear. Still, public sentiment is very much against nuclear. So as I said, even though Japanese government now set around 20% share of power generation, but I think it's not really realistic. So to fill the gap, the renewable energy should be further increased, but only 9 years, remain. So the limited lead time for renewable energy provides a huge constraint for this. But there's still some room for increasing solar PV, especially this solar sharing and the farmland, and also deregulation of especially environmental assessment process for the wind power project. So by doing so, we believe still there's some room for increasing this linear energy project. And also, it is crucial to make further effort to reduce energy and electricity consumption. So that sometimes Japan is seen as high energy efficiency country, but we think that is a myth. So there is still considerable room for improving energy efficiency. The most of them is economically valid option in the next 9 years. So we calculated that tapping this economically valid option, it is possible to reduce 30% in the final energy consumption by 2030, and also 20% reduction in electricity demand by 2030. So by doing so, without relying on the nuclear, we think we can achieve that 46% reduction target. But still, there are some potential for energy efficiency, but we need policy measure to tap these opportunities. So there are a wide range of policy menu is considered, but what is really lacking in Japan is carbon pricing. Still now government is discussing the carbon pricing, but we hope within this year some basic stance will be agreed within the government. Also, provide this, the final slide provides some policy option for improving the energy efficiency. Okay, that's it from my side. Thank you very much.
Dr. Kentaro Tamura, 프로그램 국장님.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kentaro Tamura, for that insightful presentation. So I understand that 46% is Japanese NDC goal by 2030, and I understand that it is the plan to raise that further to 50%. In the past, I understand also that energy policy will be set before climate policies would be set. However, now the order has been shifted in Japan. So it was good to learn about the latest information about Japan and its climate policies. Next, we would like to move on to our next presentation. The next presenter is Dr. Miles Petrie from the European Commission. If you look at the European Union, it recently announced Fit for 55. So I understand that he will probably cover that topic during his presentation.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to come after such an enriching series of presentations. It's very inspiring. So yes, I'm going to talk about the EU NDC and European Green Deal and EU climate action, including Fit for 55, the latest EU climate action news. So first of all, sorry, excuse me. Yeah, here we go. Right. So first of all, just some brief summary information about the European Union. So as I'm sure you know, Europe is a continent, and the European Union is a political intergovernmental organization combining 27 member states and accounting for 16% of GDP and 8% of greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously Germany, as represented by Diana, is one of the largest, well, the largest member state, and in terms of population and economy. So I'm going to talk about the general EU level climate action, which includes many EU level policies and measures. But there is only one EU NDC, which is in terms of the Paris Agreement, a commitment to act jointly. And so that's what I'm going to talk about. So there's the EU has more than a decade of experience in analysing climate action and then setting policies based on that. So the right side of the screen here is obviously the most recent developments. This includes the European Green Deal, the enhanced NDC, and the Fit for 55 package, which are the things I'm going to talk about today. So the European Green Deal was announced in 2019, and this is the EU's overarching strategy to tackle climate change and environmental problems while ensuring a competitive and inclusive economy, including the issue of just transition that Diana spoke about. So it's a little different to the experience of Japan. I think we've been setting climate targets and basing energy policies on them for a few years now. And the difference is that with the European Green Deal, even the climate gets put into this wrapper of inclusive environmental, economic, and social action. So these are the goals we've set ourselves, just placed on a chart. So the EU has set a goal for what we call climate neutrality, which means net zero emissions by 2050. And then this year it was formalized in the European climate law. So this is now a legal target with a series of milestones and ways to track progress towards it. And we also now have the new NDC target of a 55% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And the previous target was 40, and it's been changed to 55. So that's the recent enhancement. So the European climate law, I won't read everything that's on the screen, but these are just a few elements of this law that was passed earlier this year, which sets into a legal framework our climate neutrality objective. So it puts including the 2030 target as a milestone towards 2050, the obligation to also set a target for 2040, and also the obligation to check whether we're on track and to potentially do more if we're not on track for our own targets. The EU has some experience in setting targets and also in taking the action to meet them. So our target for 2020 was a 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, by 2019 emissions had fallen by 24%, so that's encouraging. And then yes, now we have these targets for 55% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. And as you can see, they're both upward revisions compared to our previous goals. Setting the target is half of the struggle, but it's also important to take action, otherwise the target is empty. So these are the measures which are currently on the statute books as a currently EU law, and these are the things which help deliver the targets. There are obviously member states like Germany have to take action to deliver in the end, but this is in part assisted by things that by measures that are undertaken at EU level to make sure everyone is on the same playing field. So these hexagons, the bottom row, refers to the measures that are currently in law to deliver the existing target, which is the minus 40%. And it includes the increasing interconnections, so making it easier to trade electricity across borders. It includes targets for reducing the emission intensity in cars, and also renewable and energy efficiency targets. These are the new hexagons. So this is the Fit for 55, the package which was proposed by the European Commission just last week. So the previous slide showed what is already legislated in the EU in order to deliver minus 40, but now we've committed in law to deliver minus 55, which means that we need to do more. And in the European Union, this starts with proposals by the European Commission. So this is the EU public administration, the place where I work. And what happens is they produce proposals that have been through an impact assessment and been through a public consultation. And then follow on the basis of these proposals, there needs to be political agreement. So this is where every member state, but also the European Parliament, need to come to a political agreement on what the laws are actually going to be to deliver minus 55. And this process has already happened. That's the previous slide. So all of the measures on the previous slide, and indeed more measures, went through this process of the European Commission proposes some ideas. Eventually, following intense political debate, the European Parliament and the member states agree on what the measures are. And so this time you can see that there's a mixture of strengthening what's already there. So we already have an emissions trading system. We already have an effort sharing regulation, which is how individual member states' efforts are divided, because you have to remember that there are strong, wealthy countries in the European Union, and also countries that are less wealthy and where action is more difficult, and so there needs to be a fairness element there. There are further plans to reduce emissions from cars. There's what's called the Social Climate Fund, which is a way of redistributing some of the proceeds of carbon pricing to make sure that nobody is left behind. There's plans to reform energy taxation. There's the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is a way of making sure that the EU industry doesn't lose out because of climate action. But as I say, all of this has been analysed in great detail, and you can read the proposals and the impact assessments at the link below. But it's also, in terms of EU legislation, the starting point. However, I'm fairly confident that something like this will be delivered, because one of the defining features of EU climate action is that the NDC is the promise that we've made to the world collectively, that this is our target and we intend to meet it. But when the EU makes promises like that, it's also the promise that the 27 member states have made to each other, which means that we've all collectively committed to do it, and this, I think, has already shown that it's a way of making climate action in the European Union strong, and you can see that by the fact that we've managed to reduce our emissions by 2020 and also put in place the policies to deliver the previous target. This is just an at a glance vision of what the new 55 might look like. It's the kind of high level way of splitting up the target, because as you may know, the European Union has an ETS, the emissions trading system, which is I think the largest emissions trading system in the world, covering not only power but also basically most stationary industry and also aviation as well. So that's roughly half of EU emissions, and so that has to take some of the burden. And so the estimated contribution for the new target will be that the ETS has to reduce emissions by minus 61%. There'll also be some expansion of its sectoral coverage, I believe, and then 40% has to be delivered outside the ETS, which means that it's a question of member states taking action themselves. So there's an element of individual member state responsibility. It's not just managed by the European Union, but also the policies that are put in place, things like CO2 in cars and various energy efficiency standards that helps every member state reach these targets. And then also land use is also part of our target. So the target does include removals from the land sector, but they have to be extra removals from the land sector compared to what would have happened anyway. So there's no free lunch in climate policy. So I will leave it there. Oh no, I will not leave it there, because I had one last slide, which is on just transition, because it's a very important part of climate action. I think others have said, indeed, the colleague from the IEA right at the start said that climate action will probably create many more jobs than might be lost. However, it is important to have just transition, especially in fossil fuel intensive sectors. And these maps just show that in terms of fossil fuel extraction, there aren't too many regions of the EU where this is a very large share of employment. That's the left-hand map. But if you look on the right-hand map, you see that when it comes to energy-intensive industry, that is actually a significant employer in large parts of the EU, and I'm sure the same is true in Korea. So that demonstrates how important just transition is. And if you look into the details of the European Green Deal and also the EU budget as a whole, you can see that lots of resources, up to 150 billion euro, are being mobilized in the just transition mechanism, which is a cover term for many initiatives designed at helping to reorient the economy of regions and sectors that are fossil fuel reliant at the moment. So yes, now I will end my presentation. Thank you very much, everybody.
네, 닥터 마이스 페리, 유럽연합 집행위원회 경제 담당관님.
Thank you, Dr. Perry from the European Commission for your great presentation. Next, we will be hearing a presentation. But the presenter could not be with us today because of the time difference, because we have presenters from Europe, North America, and Asia. We will be hearing a pre-recorded message from Mr. Rick Duke, Senior Advisor of the State Department.
Thank you for the opportunity to record this message. I have to start by acknowledging that the United States lost a lot of ground on climate over the past 4 years. But President Biden has made a clear and unwavering commitment to restore American leadership on climate, both at home and abroad. On his first day in office, President Biden rejoined the Paris Agreement. Within his first 100 days, at the Earth Day Leader Summit on Climate, President Biden announced a new nationally determined contribution to cut net greenhouse gas emissions 50 to 52% below 2005 levels. This new 2030 target, paired with new announcements from Canada and Japan, and steps by the EU to legislate their strong target, and a new pace-setting 2035 UK goal, put over half the global economy. Thank you for the opportunity to record this message. I have to start by moving faster to reduce its emissions in this crucial decade. To develop the US NDC, the administration analyzed how every sector of the economy can contribute. We also drew from a wide range of analyses done by third parties, including Princeton University, University of Maryland, Rodian Group, MIT, EDF, NRDC, and others, all showing pathways consistent with our NDC. Our 2030 target picks up the pace of emission reductions relative to our prior 2020 and 2025 goals, and it supports and is consistent with President Biden's commitments to create a carbon pollution-free power sector by 2035 and net zero emissions economy no later than 2050. The 2030 target also builds on leadership from mayors, governors, businesses, investors, and communities that have worked tirelessly to ensure sustained progress in reducing climate pollution in the United States, including over the past 5 years. It also serves as a clear signal to all of these stakeholders to scale up even faster clean, low-carbon technologies across the whole economy. There are many policy and technology pathways to the reductions we need, and we're confident that states, cities, and the private sector would once again backstop federal action to the extent that they needed to if there were a change in administration in 2025. But for these remarks, I will focus on federal actions the Biden administration is undertaking in its first 4-year term to help deliver on our NDC. Federally, We're deploying the entire government with vigor and creativity to hit this target. Across all sectors and all greenhouse gases, we're pushing a combination of incentives and standards. On incentives, we're pursuing transformative investments in climate technologies through new legislation broadly introduced as the American Jobs Plan. This is a top priority for the President, follows successful passage of the American Rescue Plan that addresses the pandemic decisively. And this investment in clean energy and climate is broadly popular. It will involve hundreds of billions in funding with durable tax credits for renewables and other key emissions-reducing technologies at its core. We're also pursuing incentives for clean energy through the federal budget itself and through existing federal programs. We see synergies between these incentives and standards. In particular, incentives make it more feasible to pass more ambitious standards, whether through legislation or regulations, and to work together to help reduce emissions more quickly. To give you a better sense of our plans, I'll give you a quick tour through key sectors of the economy. First, I'll start with the power sector, where again, we're committed to 100% clean power by 2035. And this can be achieved through multiple cost-effective pathways. They all include incentives for renewables and transmission to the budget and the other legislative mechanisms that we are pursuing. And they all involve deploying rapidly renewables and other carbon-free generation technologies, new transmission and energy storage, and investing in retaining existing nuclear and developing carbon capture and storage. Our Environmental Protection Agency has far-ranging proven tools to regulate fossil generators at the same time. This is both to reduce greenhouse gas emissions directly and to ensure that these generators reduce public health pollutants like mercury and particulate matter. Second, let me say a word about the transportation sector, which is now the largest emissions sector in the U.S. economy. And again, we have large-scale incentives planned for electric vehicles, charging infrastructure, including under existing programs and legislation. We also are pursuing standards for both light-duty vehicles and other vehicles, and investments in a wide range of transportation infrastructure, including transit and rail. Third, in the industrial sector, we're investing heavily in carbon capture and storage, in hydrogen and other technologies and solutions, and in government procurement power to make sure that we scale up low carbon or zero carbon industrial production. And at the same time, our Environmental Protection Agency is pursuing standards, including for the oil and gas sector to address potent methane emissions. Cutting across the whole energy sector, of course, we are pursuing efficient electrification, and this includes substantial incentives for key technologies like heat pumps, but also reinvigorating the Department of Energy's Proven Appliance Standards program and its Building Codes program, which has already delivered hundreds of billions in consumer and business benefits over previous years, and which has a track record that we're going to use once again to deliver those kinds of savings and related carbon reductions. We're also looking at the forest sector and the agricultural sector and leveraging existing programs and new congressional investments to bolster carbon sinks in our soils and our forests, and to encourage smarter agricultural practices that reduce pollutants like N2O and methane. There are programs like the Commodity Credit Corporation that has tens of billions of dollars in flexible funds that can be used to encourage smarter, higher productivity, and lower GHG agricultural practices. And our rural utility service has billions that can be used to invest in renewables that help with improving the economics of farming and cut pollution at the same time. Finally, the United States is committed to reducing not just CO2, but all non-CO2 greenhouse gases, including methane and hydrofluorocarbons. And On the hydrofluorocarbons front, we're proud that we have a brand new legislation, the ENG Act, that will put us squarely on track to deliver on our Kigali Amendment commitments. And we have regulations in process to put that in place straight away. Similarly, we're moving on all sources of methane, including landfill methane, and of course the fossil methane and agricultural methane sources that I referenced above, and investing in technologies, including through our ARPA-E program, to reduce methane more cost effectively and comprehensively. So we're pushing across the board at the federal level to deliver on our 2030 NDC. And we're confident that we can deliver. But we can't predict the exact balance of federal action, subnational action, and private sector leadership that will deliver the reductions we need. It's worth noting, though, that U.S. emissions were down over 20% below 2005 levels in 2020, which exceeded our 2009 era goal to have it in the range of 17% reductions by 2020. And even without the pandemic, we would likely have hit this criterion. And this was possible because subnational actors, private sector, and others stayed the course, even as federal leadership wavered. And actually, many of the federal policies we put in place under the Obama-Biden administration proved durable, ranging from appliance efficiency standards to mercury standards and other regulations on coal power plants to federal tax credits for renewables that helped to propel us to the largest renewables deployment year ever in the U.S. Just last year in 2020. So there are many ways to get there, depending on how each sector delivers, but all the efforts are going to require a sprint that achieves rapid reductions in emissions in the power sector, electrifies our end uses, bolsters our land carbon sinks, and controls potent non-CO2 gases. All of these efforts are going to put us on pace for new sales of technologies like EVs and heat pumps that, when we play out post-2030, will be what's required to deliver net zero by 2050 as the stock turns over in buildings and vehicles and the like. And of course, all these efforts by the United States are going to help to drive down costs of key low-carbon technologies like electric vehicles, which will propel progress globally. And at the same time, as other governments pick up the pace, we will benefit from lower technology costs globally as scale is achieved on that global basis. So we're excited about our goal. We're excited about working with other countries to enhance ambition and deliver against our respective targets. And above all, we're excited about doing what it takes to keep a safer 1.5C future within reach. Thank you.
네, 미국 존 캐리 기후특사.
Yes, that was Mr. Rick Duke, a senior advisor for the State Department of the United States. So earlier we learned the presentation or heard the presentation by IEA. Again, the United States is planning to decarbonize the power sector, energy sector by 2035. So that was very impressive. Next, we would like to listen to a recorded message of Mr. Douglas Nevison, Assistant Deputy Minister of the Climate Change Canada.
Hi, I'm very pleased to participate in this session to share information on Canada's national plan. I will begin by providing an overview of Canada's recent actions on climate change, with a focus on the publication of our fourth biennial report. Canada continues to implement the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, adopted in 2016. Last December, the government announced Canada's Strengthened Climate Plan with new and enhanced federal measures to increase ambition and ensure Canada is on track to meet and exceed our original 2030 nationally determined contribution. Further demonstrating Canada's commitment to climate action, we are amongst a growing list of countries to commit to reaching net zero emissions by 2050, and one of the first in the world to develop domestic legislation toward that goal. Finally, at the Leaders Summit on Climate in April, Canada announced we would increase our 2030 target to 40 to 45% below 2005 levels. Since 2016, we have been working to implement measures under the Pan-Canadian framework. The framework includes more than 50 concrete actions under 4 pillars: pricing carbon pollution, complementary actions to reduce emissions, adaptation and climate resilience, and clean technology, innovation, and jobs. Some key actions are highlighted on the slide, including pricing carbon pollution, which I will briefly speak to. Canada's approach to pricing carbon pollution is flexible. Any province or territory can design its own pricing system tailored to local needs, provided they meet the federal standard. Since 2019, every jurisdiction in Canada has a price on carbon pollution, either through their own system or the federal system. The federal system includes a regulatory charge on fuel and returns all proceeds to individuals, families, and businesses through payments and climate action programs. The federal system also includes an output-based pricing system for large industry, with proceeds supporting work to decarbonize industrial sectors. Canada's Strengthened Climate Plan, released in December 2020, highlights new federal actions that build on continuing work with provinces and territories through the Pan-Canadian framework. The plan includes 64 strengthened and new federal measures with $15 billion in Canadian dollars in new investments. The Government of Canada is committed to continue pricing carbon pollution, with the current price scheduled to increase by $15 per year starting in 2023, rising to $170 per ton in 2030. The government is also committed to working with provinces and territories to advance shared priorities that will further lower emissions, and to advancing Indigenous climate leadership to ensure that federal policies and programs are designed to address Indigenous peoples' climate priorities. Like the Pan-Canadian framework, the Strengthened Climate Plan is not an endpoint, but it will play a key role in achieving our 2030 target and establishing the building blocks to get to net zero by 2050. Canada's most recent federal budget announced an additional $17.6 billion to build a clean economy. This funding builds on the $15 billion for Canada's Strengthened Climate Plan and nearly $15 billion for public transit. Canada also recognizes that climate change is a global threat and that countries around the world need to do more on a faster timeline. That is why Canada and the United States forged a renewed bilateral relationship in February through the release of the roadmap for a renewed U.S.-Canada partnership and the launch of the U.S.-Canada high-level ministerial dialogue on climate ambition. Prior to the Pan-Canadian framework, Canada's GHG emissions were forecast to grow to 815 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2030. Through the measures implemented under both the Pan-Canadian framework and the Strengthened Climate Plan, Canada's emissions are now forecast to decrease to 503 megatons by 2030, a reduction of 31%. The investments made in Canada's most recent federal budget, along with other actions, such as strengthened alignment with the United States on transportation and methane emissions, mean that Canada is now positioned to reduce emissions by about 36% below 2005 levels by 2030. Canada intends to provide our formal NDC submission to the UNFCCC in the coming weeks in support of a new target range of 40 to 45% below 2005 levels. In 2019, Canada's greenhouse gas emissions were 730 megatons. The emissions intensity for Canada's entire economy has declined by 37% since 1990 and by 23% since 2005. The decline in emissions intensity can be attributed to fuel switching, increases in efficiency, the modernization of industrial processes, and the structural changes in the economy. The oil and gas sector remains the largest source of emissions, accounting for 26% of total emissions in 2019. In our fourth biennial report, we noted that we have now established accounting approaches for each of the land use change, and forestry subsectors. For almost all subsectors, the accounting approach compares net emissions in a given year with the net emissions in the base year, the net-net approach. Given the unique characteristics of forests, which are significantly impacted by the effects of past management and natural disturbances, Canada uses a reference level approach for remaining forest land and the associated harvested wood products. With respect to internationally traded mitigation outcomes, Canada continues to examine its approach. Canada's federal government will continue to work with interested provinces and territories and international partners to ensure that allowances acquired through international emissions trading are counted towards Canada's international targets, and will ensure that applicable guidance under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement is taken into account. In alignment with the latest science on limiting global temperature rise, the government tabled the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act in Canada's Parliament last November. When passed into law, this act will formalize a process to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. In addition to the ultimate target of net zero emissions in 2050, the act would require the government to set national emissions reduction targets at 5-year intervals, along with associated emissions reduction plans, progress reports, and final assessment reports on the achievement of each target. In February, Canada launched the Net Zero Advisory Body, a group of experts who will undertake robust engagement and provide the Government of Canada with independent advice on promising pathways to reach net zero. Since the Paris Agreement, Canada has developed the Pan-Canadian Framework, followed by a strengthened climate plan and draft legislation to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Canada has continued to work with provinces and territories, Indigenous peoples, stakeholders, and Canadians, and remains keenly focused on implementing our commitments as per the Paris Agreement, including support for international climate finance. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to your questions.
네, 더글라스 네비자 캐나다 환경기후
Douglas Nevision, Assistant Deputy Minister of the Climate Change Canada. Thank you for the presentation. Before we go on to the discussion, we will like to have a 10-minute break to organize the seatings for the discussions. After a 10-minute break, we will resume the international webinar.
네, 여러분 안녕하십니까? 오늘 웨비나
Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Professor Byung An from Hoseo University here in Korea, and I will be moderating this discussion session. So we heard about the NDCs and also climate action plans of key countries in our previous session, and I believe that these have significant implications on our NDC and how we're going to also improve our NDC to be more ambitious. In this webinar, with related to Korea's NDC, we didn't hear any presentation, and therefore we have invited over 5 designated discussants. These 5 discussants will be serving as presenters/discussants. Therefore, as we have learned about the NDCs of key countries, based on those presentations, in adjusting our NDC, I would like to ask our discussants to think about and share with us what we need to do in order to improve Korea's NDC, and also in discussing the new NDC, what would be the things that we would have to consider, and also the principles that we would have to consider. So I would appreciate it if you could focus on that during your discussion. Allow me to briefly introduce to you our discussants. We'll start from my right. From Korea Environment Institute, we have Senior Research Fellow, Mr. Chang-hoon Lee. And from Korea Institute for Industrial Economics and Trade, we have Eun-mi Chung. And from Korea Institute of Energy Technology Evaluation Planning, we have Senior Researcher Sung-ho Lee. And from Solutions for Our Climate, we have Attorney at Law and also Head of SFOC, Mr. Chujin Kim. And finally, from the Youth Climate Emergency Action, we have Eun-bin Kang. Now, we have originally assigned about 70 minutes for our discussion session. But as we have 5 discussants altogether, I would like to give 7 minutes each to our discussants. And if I find points that require further elaboration, I will ask the discussant to speak a little more. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite over Dr. Chang-hoon Lee from Korea Environment Institute.
It is a pleasure to meet you. I am from KEI, Chang-hoon Lee. It is a great pleasure for me to be speaking at this significant occasion. I think the other countries have done their tasks, and it is now time for us to do our work. We have to increase and in our targets, but we have to think about the reality as well. So we need to mix both top-down and bottom-up standards in making adjustments to our NDC. From the principle side, why do we need to readjust our NDCs and increase it? We are trying to achieve a target of 1.5 degrees, and that is a common goal globally. In order to achieve 1.5 degrees, the global carbon budget that is left in Korea, we need to think about how much emissions is left for us, and based on this, we need to identify the NDC that is fit for Korea. However, this is not easy. That is because the global carbon budget, we can calculate that. However, allocating that by countries, it should be a fair allocation. That is the principle. However, the interpretation of that principle will be different for different countries. Therefore, it is not easy to come to a consensus of the allocation. If you look at my presentation material on the bottom, you will see in IPCC, the 1.5 degree special report, in order to achieve this, according to IPCC, the entire world has to achieve net zero by 2050. the entire world. There should be global net zero. But if you think about it, there are countries that have emitted more, and they have the capability to reduce their emissions, and they need to achieve net zero before 2050 so that developing countries can follow suit. And according to Climate Tracker Act, countries such as Korea and other developed countries, they need to achieve net zero by 2040. And in that case, Korea's 2030 NDC goals should be increased dramatically. And we heard from other developed countries through their presentations today, but they cannot achieve the 2040 target. EU, US, and UK, they have announced net zero by 2050, and most institutions agree that this is not 1.5 target, but a 2-degree target. Therefore, it would be a bit burdensome for Korea to achieve 1.5 degrees target alone. And if this top-down method is not possible, then we need to think about a more realistic bottom-up method, reviewing other peer countries. That could be a way for us to set our targets, and this can help in setting additional targets. And in this presentation, in addition, I would like to say that we need to consider realistic factors for the bottom-up. The bottom-up method is considering transportation industries and their capabilities and potential to make reductions. According to what has been known, power generation is the area where you can achieve most reductions. So I want to talk about this. This is now going on to the level of major countries' increase in their NDCs. Based on 2005, US said that they are going to make a reduction of 26 to 28% by 2025, and Japan, they have increased their initial target of 26 to 46%, and the target year is 2030. The previous NDC and the revised NDC, I want to compare this with the Korean situation, and we need to use the same standard, and one standard can be 2017, using this as the base year. Compared to the 2017 levels, what is the reduction rate for 2030? We can consider their reduction rate. According to their initial NDCs, it's mostly in the 20s, 20-some percent. And Korea's NDC, it was 24.5% for Korea. And our NDC and the previous NDC of other countries are similar. And for the new NDC, they have a target of reducing more than 40% compared to 2017. So compared to 2017, they will be reducing by 40%, and Germany, they have a reduction rate of more than 50%. According to this standard, Korea's new NDC should be at the early 40%. And so this is about the results, and if we can use another basis to do a calculation. For example, let's say a country wanted to reduce by 30%, and they have set their new target as 45%. Then you can make a calculation of 15 to 30. It's a 50% increase. So this is a relative reduction rate. And according to this relative standard being used, it seems that most countries have set their new NDC targets to be 30 to 70% above their previous targets. Or you can use the straight line trajectory to see the 2030 levels compared to 2050 net zero target. Most countries' new NDC using the straight line method, if you do a comparison, you will see that's very similar. Japan, it's basically on that straight line, and in the case of UK, their new NDC is stronger than the straight line, and for other countries it's similar to the straight line, this linear method. And using these three standards to make a adjustment to Korea's NDC and to be comparable to other countries, it seems that Korea needs to make it about 40%. For the linear method, it would be 39%. And so, in terms of the reduction, it would be about 40%, and amount, it will be 100 million tons. So this is more of the what we need to do. It's the principle, but if you think about realistically what is possible, for the power generation, we can make reductions because there are alternative fuels and the technology has been proven. But this will lead to increase in the utility prices. Therefore, the acceptability in the public will be a hurdle. And according to Korea's electricity plan, we have the 9th electricity supply and demand basic plan, and we have coal power generation, and if we can reduce this to 10% to 15%, we can make a reduction of 100 million ton. And the coal, is this going to be replaced by renewable energy or LNG? There are different options based on the alternative fuels, and we can reduce it by 50 million to 100 million by reducing coal power plants. If it is reduced by half, then we can have a reduction of 550 million to 100 million. So in summary, when deciding on the NDC, we can think about what is the just method, and we can also think about reality, and according to the current levels, it should be reduced from 20 to 40%, and it should be a reduction of 100 million ton. And considering the realistic situation for power generation, we can make reductions there, and that will cover for 3/4 of what needs to be reduced, but it will lead to increase in utility costs, and there can be additional areas in which we can make reductions, and there has to be additional analysis of transportation, buildings, and industry. Thank you very much, Dr. Lee, for your presentation. So a country's NDC, when that is decided, depending on what principles you use, the NDCs can be different. Therefore, you need to decide on the principle to determine your NDC. Dr. Lee explained this in his presentation, and I also think that there can be two methods used. The first one would be for Korea to achieve 2050 net zero, and we made that declaration already. So for us to achieve 2050 net zero, there will be a pathway to achieve that. It should be aligned with that 2050 target. The 2030 NDC should be aligned with that, and I think that is most important. And in achieving the 1.5-degree target, what contributions can Korea make? And the second principle is about what is realistically possible. Korea, in 2009, set its 2020 targets, and the 2020 targets, we were shy of 200 million tons, and so we received a lot of criticism internationally because of that. Therefore, when we set our targets, it should be genuine. In other words, it needs to be realistic, and we need to consider the reality when we set these goals, and that is a bottom-up analysis that was mentioned by Dr. Lee.
Next, I would like to invite our second discussant. Unfortunately, yes, she's right there. I guess she has some presentation to share with us. So I understand that you will be delivering your presentation from there. Now you have the floor. Well, nothing special, but I did prepare a PowerPoint presentation, PPT, for my presentation. So when it comes to industry, so I think that it's important to look at what can be achieved, and we also have to look at bottom-up approaches and also realistic approaches. So I would like to take you through this presentation deck that I prepared. It's not moving. Can anyone help? Yes, it's not working. If you look at the industrial sector, it emits the most greenhouse gas emissions in Korea. It has direct emissions and also indirect emissions. And you can see that if you include indirect, it would account for 50%. And if you look at 60 key industries in the manufacturing sector, they take about 71% of the entire greenhouse gas emissions. And on the left-hand side, you can see steel, petrochemical, cement, refinery, display, and they actually emit a lot in terms of direct and processing emissions. And at the same time, if you look at indirect emissions, you see at the high end of the list include steel, petrochemical, auto, and also others. Others include a lot of small and medium-sized companies, as well as parts and components manufacturing companies. On the right-hand side, you can see a diagram, and this is how the manufacturing sector is made up of. Points painted in yellow actually shows steel, auto, and green represent refinery and oil and petrochemical, and red represents advanced and cutting-edge technologies. And greenhouse gas heavy emitters actually include the industry that are painted in blue. As they are processed, they do contribute to cutting-edge industry. So it's very important to look at how the industry is interconnected. You have to understand the whole flow. And instead of just looking at the front-end industries, I think that you have to understand the full picture. And when it comes to the greenhouse gas emissions, yes, it is true that the industry sector does emit a lot. And since the 21st century, you can see that they still did emit a lot. However, if you look at the added value that they create and also the volume of goods and products that they produce, you can see that there has been some decoupling. But even so, if you look at the overall growth, I think it's important to look at how we're going to ensure safe lending. Again, in this chart, it's marked in red. When it comes to direct and processing emissions, I think that we have to work on processing changes and processing improvements and also fuel changes. And we also have to look at how we can enhance energy efficiency and also seek energy transition. So again, I think that to target climate change, especially in the industry sector, we have to have midterm and also long-term goals. The goal and the target is clear. I think that we have to fundamentally change the production system that we have. If you look at Europe and also other advanced countries, they've been preparing for this for like the past 20, 30 years. And Korea only has like 30 years remaining in its timeline in order to fundamentally change its economy. EU has actually peaked in the mid-20th century and also has been preparing for this energy transition for many years now. However, Korea, we've only focused on efficiency. Here you can see 1990 and in 2017. And you can see that Korea has been a lot of emissions, and that means that we have to even significantly reduce the greenhouse gas emissions going forward. In order to make that happen, we have to seek innovation in the industry and also build green infrastructure in order to support this campaign. And also for businesses, they have to improve their processes and overall, I believe that industry-wide, businesses need to have a broader market to accommodate their transformation. Here you can see carbon neutrality pathway. Here I have long-term and short-term. Overall, it's really important that we have to move towards new industries. And in moving to new industries, we have to make sure to have strong competitiveness. It's not about growth seeking only. It's about industrial and environmental competitiveness and having a balance between the two. So green carbon, rather low carbon society, and also green industry has to go hand in hand. I also have others. Here I have smart manufacturing sector. I believe that smart manufacturing and digital transformation is important. Digital transformation and also carbon neutrality has to also be harmonized in order to realize 2050 net zero. Overall, on the left-hand side on the slide, you can see that these are some of the methods required in order to make our key industries carbon neutral. These would require major technological innovations. And on the right-hand side, these are something that we can do by changing and implementing new regulations and also mechanisms and institutions. However, in the middle, you can see that they are also intertwined and they go hand in hand. Also, they can also accelerate each other. Here I have written down the key issues and challenges. When we think about technologies, it's not simply technology. It's about bringing about a new paradigm, and therefore we need R&D, we need CapEx. And when we are talking about energy, we also have to work on green energy and also green hydrogen. And those are key premises for our industrial transition and transformation. We need to have green energy and green fuel in order to accelerate industrial transition into a cleaner phase. We also have to have short-term emissions reduction plans and also long-term growth plans. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that presentation. Dr. Chung, I understand, has been studying Korean industries for many years now, and I understand that she also has a lot of communications ongoing with industrial representatives, and she fully understands the difficulties and challenges faced by Korean industries. And I believe that clearly during her presentation, she mentioned how Korea is different from the European Union and what strategies we need to have in order to make up for that difficulties. Next, I would like to move on to our third discussion. It's Lee Sung-ho.
Hello, everyone. As was introduced, I am Sung-ho Lee. We heard about foreign cases. Achieving net zero by 2050 seems to be a given. And now we are seeing that in major countries, they have concrete plans to achieve their 2030 NDCs. And the 2030 goals and targets, compared to their previous NDCs, it has been adjusted and it is much more ambitious than their previous NDCs. Therefore, Korea also has set targets, and we are at the National Assembly discussing various acts to legislate 2050 net zero, and we are going to be announcing our new and revised NDCs before the COP26 November meeting, and it will be announced in fall. And I think that's the main point of today's webinar. The policies of Korea up to now on climate was within our limitations. So we considered our constraints when we set our targets. But if you compare other countries, this is not enough, and this approach is not enough. It has to be what is acceptable in international society. And once we set our targets, we need to come up with detailed and concrete plans to realize such targets. And before it was about what is possible, but now we must set the target first and then come up with plans and strategies to achieve that target. That seems to be the change in approach. And we saw the IAEA report. So worldwide, clean energy and renewable energy, there's a lot of investment in this area. It is receiving a boom, and fossil fuel that has sustained civilization thus far does not have to be used. And we now talk about carbon neutrality, and by 2030 for us to come up with NDCs, we need to find new fuel. And I think we, relatively speaking, do not talk enough about renewable energy, though. When we set up our basic energy supply and demand plan, you set renewable energy as a major part, and only in the 8th basic plan, we talked about setting up a grid for renewable energy. So it shows that we did not have enough consideration for renewable energy thus far. And on renewable energy, recently, there's a lot of concerns about intermittency of the renewable energy, but we hear from IAEA that there can be like digitalization of renewable energy, and therefore it could become a true source of energy. And for Korea to achieve net zero by 2050 and to achieve our NDC by 2030, we need to use carbon producing fuel less, and we need to expand renewable energy, and there has to be a pooling of national wisdom to expand renewable energy, because in the past couple of years we were talking a lot about reducing, phasing out nuclear power plants, and that is why there was negative comments about renewable energy, and there was some imbalance in the discussions about energy mix. So it is a challenge for us going forward to have appropriate discussions on renewable energy. And the target level of 2030 NDC, this is a hot topic. 50 to 52% for US, 55% for EU, and Japan, 46%. They have set their NDC targets. We have to be at least on par with these levels. It is not easy, and these other countries, it will not be easy for them as well. Yet they are persuading those with vested interest, and they are allocating a lot of budget for this. So we have to have political commitment to set our NDCs in a more ambitious way. Well, in any case, the National Assembly, they are contemplating climate acts and climate basic acts and so forth. And other countries, it seems that they cannot put everything into one legislation at the first jab. You have to work on it, and there needs to be fine-tuning, and parts that need to be supplemented as we go forward. And there will be supplementary laws that come out after the Basic Act. In the EU, they have the Fit for 55, so they have this big package, and there will be action plans aligned with that. So for Korea too, we need to have the basic setup and then action plans. So on the basic plan, we hope that the key points can be summarized and organized and legislated quickly. And for the concrete action plans, the details have to be worked out later on, and then it can be legislated for the detailed laws. And Korea we need to address climate situation, and we had the Green New Deal declared by the president, and this triggered discussions in earnest. So we will have to continue on with these discussions for the year end to set forth more ambitious targets, and this has to continue. It's not going to be done overnight, and even if individual laws have some limitations, we need to continue on with these efforts and work on it. Thank you very much. Dr. Lee talked about renewable energy, and he is one of the leading experts in renewable energy. After we hear from the other discussants, I would like to ask some questions to Dr. Lee on renewable energy.
Next, our fourth discussant is Jujin Kim from Solutions for Our Climate. Yes, hello everyone. My name is Jujin Kim. I would like to, at the outset, thank Energytransitionkorea and also the Presidential Committee on Carbon Neutrality 2050 for the invitation. As you understand, I think that in order to realize net zero 2050, power sector is something that's really important for us to tackle. We actually worked with KAIST and developed some scenarios. And again, in order to realize 2050 net zero, power consumption is going to double by 2050. And if you look at the energy sector, I'm not sure whether or not the current providers can provide all the energy. There are businesses who can't realize RA100, and there are some dominant players in the power sector in Korea, and I think that it is posing a lot of risks to our Korean industries. I'm very curious to learn what Chang thinks about this. Anyways, related to this topic, I would like to point out two elements. First and foremost, I would like to focus on Jeju Island. Now, Jeju actually has seen some conflict between fossil fuels and also with their economic growth, and I will talk about that. And not only Korea, but also in other Asian countries, we see a lot of changes or challenges posed by dominant energy providers. So now I'd like to talk about Jeju Island and also the cartel. In raising the NDC, the Korean government is talking about and also complaining about a lot of difficulties. It's not about expensive renewable energy prices or public acceptance. I think that it's about power system flexibility. The international community is asking and pressuring Korea to make the NDC more ambitious. However, we are saying that it's because of the inflexibility of our power system. However, I think that Jeju Island actually give us some answers, and I think that it actually proves that the government's approach is not correct. As you all know, in Jeju Island, there are a lot of renewable energy facilities being built up, and at the same time, around the same period of time, you can see that we also have a lot of gas power plants in Jeju, more than what the power system can accommodate. Now, most of these facilities, the gas facilities, are owned by KEPCO or KEPCO affiliates, and also renewables are owned by many different stakeholders, in fact, public and private. And one more thing that I'd like to point out is that, yes, we have the energy basic plan, but if you look at power generators, no one actually is responsible for their finances. I believe that Carbon Neutrality Committee chairperson actually met with the press, and he also talked about how building new coal power plants is troublesome. And that is something that has to be addressed. Now, coming back to Jeju Island. Now, in Jeju, KEPCO is the owner of the power system. Now, if the power generation goes up, then who are you going to pose disadvantage to? Is it going to be the renewable energy providers or the gas providers? So who are you going to target for curtailment? It depends on the technology and also the capacity of the power generators. And the technological guideline has to be set, and also the market rule has to be set. And in doing so, of course, KEPCO would have a lot of influence. It either provides technical advice or it's one of the board members of KRX. So not only KEPCO, but KEPCO affiliates actually sit on the board of KRX. Therefore, KEPCO has a lot of dominant influence over the power system operation. So KEPCO has a lot of influence, and would KEPCO accept any measures that would affect its affiliated power generators in adjusting the power system? Not really, because it's going to eventually negatively impact the bottom line of its affiliates. I think that bringing flexibility to the power system to make it more friendly to renewables, it's going to attack or impact negatively the bottom line of KEPCO and its affiliates. And therefore, I think that to maintain the status quo is going to be what KEPCO wants, and it's only reasonable. And the information is only dominated by KEPCO and its affiliated companies. And so if Korean government increases NDC or enhances NDC, the Korean government is saying that it's going to impact the power system. However, deep down, you can see that there is this kind of conflict of interest, and deep down, there are stakeholders that can be hurt. And I think that the KEPCO is the organization. KEPCO is the organization that should be working for flexibility of the power system. However, it is an entity with conflict interest. So I think that we have to address this issue in order to bring more flexibility. Now, this problem in Jeju Island, it's not only limited in Jeju, it's for the entire peninsula. It's for Japan, Southeast Asia, China, and elsewhere where they have dominant power generators. I think that in detail, there can be some slight changes, but overall, they have similar challenges. In these countries, you can see that the renewable percentage is rather limited in the entire energy mix, and they still do heavily depend on coal and other fossil fuel generators. And the retail energy market is also dominated by these power generators. So these power generators, dominant power market players, are favoring and giving more advantage to their affiliated companies. And it's only natural. And they are growing, and as they grow, and as they expand, they try to build more gas power plants and also coal power plants. And as of last year, and also at the P4G meeting, this was also brought up, coal financing. So in my personal view, I think that the entire climate community and also Korea should think of this issue not as a matter that is limited to a certain country. I think that this can be a significant problem. If we didn't have these similar issues in other countries like Germany and other European countries, then no one would pay attention to this matter. If President Biden asks Korea to display more leadership when it comes to its NDC, John Kerry actually did say that we need to raise our NDC. Then President Moon is going to ask a multi-minister whether we can make that happen, and multi-minister is going to say that we can't because of the inflexibility of our power system. But that should not be an excuse. The problem is with KEPCO. Damn it. And we really have to look at what the root cause is. It's KEPCO. And I think that without this dominant market player in the power sector, we can enhance our NDC up to 50%. So again, I really wanted to highlight this fundamental issue that is in the power sector. Again, Korea has been criticized as a climate villain by the international community, and I believe that this has been the case because of all these stranded assets that we have in the power sector. So we shouldn't leave it unaddressed going forward. Next, I would like to move on to new coal power plants. Currently, we have 3 new coal power plants being built. They are all private. Early this year, we actually worked with Chungnam University and also Carbon Tracker in order to analyze our power sector and also these new coal power plants utilization rate. We actually looked at the current NDC and also the upper limit set for the existing coal power plants. Now, the operation rate or the utilization rate is very poor. 2040, it's going to be about 21%. 2030, it's going to be 66%. So by 2035, it's going to be far lower. So between 2030 and 2035, these new coal power plants will not be productive and they won't be able to pay back their debt. So if somebody proposes M&A in order to purchase these coal power plants, we would have to do due diligence and the value would be virtually zero. However, the Korean government should be dealing more stringently with these new coal power plants. There are no financial risks. I believe that the investors have been, has been in more hazard and making the investments. It's like investing in bitcoins or cryptocurrencies. So again, I think that financially, this is a very easy target that we can address. Thank you very much, Mr. Jishin Kim. He mostly talked about the power system and the structural challenges and issues that we have with the Korean power system. And this definitely is something that we need to talk more about during the Q&A session. Next, we would like to invite over the fifth discussant.
We would like to hear from Eun-bin Kang from the Youth Climate Emergency Action. I think that she has prepared some material to present.
안녕하세요. 저는 청년기후 긴급행동에서 활동하고 있는
Hello everyone, I am Eun-bin Kang from Youth Climate Emergency Action. So, my presentation title is Show Your Determination through NDC to achieve net zero. Before there was a declaration by Moon administration to achieve net zero, we went here and took out the slogan demanding the need for net zero. And in order to express our request, we feel that we will do our utmost, and this is our organization. We want to trigger discussions on this, and that is because our life depends on this. 2050 net zero, we have this target, and I will be younger than my mother when it is 2050. So really, our lives depend on this. When we talk about NDC, when we talk about this, we would like to express that it really matters to us. And that is one of the main points of my discussion. So at the discussion on the climate, how we're going to address this, I heard that the National Assembly discussed this matter today. And the Youth Climate Emergency Action, as you can see here, we said that we need to make a reduction of 50% at least by 2017, and this should be legislated. So we are not politicians, we are not experts. However, one of the things that when people gather together, they always say this: we need to have social consensus. We do not have a social agreement yet. It seems that people are postponing action by talking about social consensus as an excuse. So we are not a researcher, we do not develop policies, and we do not implement policies. However, the reason why we are coming out and talking about this matter is because this is our issue. We are the ones that will experience this. That is why we need more dramatic and we need more concrete action. And we also should work as a watchdog in order to see what the government and what the private sector is doing in this area. In addition, I am here as a youth representative, and I am working with the Youth Climate Action, and they are planning to file a lawsuit to the Constitutional Court because greenhouse gases should be reduced by 30% compared to 2009, and that was a commitment made, but we have not made any reductions against the BAU. Actually, it has increased, and so what was set by the Lee Myung-bak administration, 30%. This is the scenario. If we use that scenario, then by now we should reduce greenhouse gases by 70% compared to 2017, which means that we can achieve a reduction of 200 million tons. And in order to do so, we have to make a reduction of 70%. I will change the order of my slides a little bit. So another comment that I would like to make is this. As you know, we need dramatic transition. And for dramatic transition, we need costs and we need to take action. If it is postponed, then we need to take more dramatic action. It will become more expensive and it will be more difficult. This is very obvious. And the climate crisis that we will have to endure will become stronger and will be more frequent, and our generation should not bear the burden of having to make more dramatic reductions. For 30 years, international society has been talking about this, about global warming since the 1990s, but for the past 30 years, did greenhouse gases reduce? No, it did not. You are all well aware that it has increased. So we can no longer avoid this situation. This is not a viable strategy. We should abandon this strategy and we should bring on the table all action that we can take. And according to the German Federal Court, and it was mentioned by the presenter that the German court a couple of months ago said that net zero by 2050, in achieving this target, our current climate act is not enough. Therefore, this means that if the reduction is postponed to after 2030, it will hinder the freedom of the younger generation. And so I wanted to state this here for as an example. Next. Today we heard about Western countries' cases, and before I go on to what I wanted to say here, it is that at the United Nations, Korea has been moved to an advanced country. So Korea's status is no longer a developing country in international society. So up till now, we have been saying that we are a latecomer in industrialization, therefore we have played passive. However, this is out-of-date thinking. Korea is included in the top 10% of economic development. And recently, according to Climate Action Research Center, after the Climate Leaders Summit, countries have set their targets, and according to what has been updated, if we use this, by 2030, Korea, out of the top 10 countries, Korea will be a country that has the highest per capita carbon dioxide emissions. And if you look at Asia, it's important for us to set the trend. So we are seeing the initiative of Western countries, and we can use this as a benchmark. However, Korea, Japan, and China must play an important role in setting the trends and momentum in Asia. Asia's coal power plant is being constructed by Korea, Japan, and China. So coal power plant construction needs to come to a halt, and we need to make this commitment. And Asia in Korea should become the priming water in setting the trends for addressing climate change. We should not just follow Western countries. We should try to take leadership in Asia in this. This is the last part. So we have many experts here with us, and I had the opportunity to listen to their presentations. And one thing that I want to say is that you should not be overly reliant on technology, and you should break away from technology optimism. US, and nuclear power plants leave some room, but we should take action that can be taken immediately, such as bringing an end to development of internal combustion vehicles and coal power plants, thermal power plants, and others. So instead of trying to rely on future technology development, we should take action that can be done immediately right now. And we need to have new mindsets from the public sector. They have a big responsibility in greenhouse gas emissions. They have a big responsibility, and private sectors, doesn't mean that they need to take the initiative in coming up with plans for making reductions. So I am not an expert in this area, but I wanted to say that there is a principle that cannot be compromised in carbon neutrality. It is democracy. So we need to think about food safety and food security, but we also need to think about democracy. So in addition to CCUS, there is the soils sink capacity, and there were some opportunities to hear about this, but the opportunity of agriculture and promoting agriculture in a climate-friendly way is some area that I do not see a lot of development in. One of the big problems in Korea is that 86% of Korea's population lives in urban areas. It means that as we pursue a carbon neutral society, this is a challenge that we need to overcome, because the way of living in the cities is using high electricity and high carbon products production and consumption. So that is the lifestyle of cities, and it is a lifestyle that maintains this carbon intense lifestyle. So we need to review and look at urban lifestyle, rural lifestyles and agriculture, and 100% renewable energy, the possibility of this. We need to consider that. And Dr. Lee talked about the unique characteristics of power generation, and power generation, relatively speaking, can be an area that is a low-hanging fruit in carbon reductions. But according to the Youth Climate Emergency Action, our principle is that it should break away from nuclear generation and from carbon generation. So it is difficult, but we need to devise plans for this, 100% renewable energy power generation, and we need to start now for us to realize this. There can be various scenarios that we need to review. This is obvious, and as a participant of this discussion, we hope that you can widen the possibility of 100% renewable energy. If there are areas that I am overlooking or do not understand, please let me know. And now going on to my conclusion. I think that the second half of this year is extremely important. It is the first year of the new climate era, and there will be presidential elections coming up. And as was mentioned, countries will declare their NDCs. So it is an extremely important year, but it doesn't seem that climate change is not a popular discussion topic. So why isn't it very high on the topic of discussions? We need to think about that. To give my thoughts on why we do not have a lot of discussions on this is because we do not have mainstreaming. Mainstreaming of this discussion is just about energy transition. It's limited to this area, and that is limiting the popularity of this discussion. So the Youth Climate Emergency Action has interest is on coming up with a consensus because there isn't a lot of political acceptance. We are considering ways to increase political acceptance. We hope that more people become interested in climate challenge, and we hope that more people can be hopeful and take courage in taking action. And NDCs need to be legislated for people to do so. And lastly, in our positions, in our areas, there are things that we can do. There are areas that we can contribute. Experts, you have years of experience in your field, and so you can come up with various great suggestions, and we will do our role in working as a watchdog to see if appropriate action is being taken. And it's important for us to be candid in our discussions, and we all need to do our part. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think that she covered many elements, and I especially concur with her in this point. I think that when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions reductions, I think that we've been approaching this problem in a very narrow way from a technological point of view. Yes, we have to search for technological solutions. Yes, technology is important in addressing climate change. However, when it comes to carbon neutrality and also greenhouse gas emissions reductions, I believe that we require as a leverage technological solutions, but at the same time, I think that changing the way we live can also serve as a solution. I think that there can be an easier way. For example, working 4 days a week, 4-day work program was proposed. In the past, we actually worked 6 days a week, and currently we work 5 days a week, and now we're talking about 4 days a week. Now, by changing the way we live, I think that we can change our impact to greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that this is also an important topic for us to talk about. And because of COVID-19, a lot of us are working from home, and I think that this is also a change of way we work. By changing how we work, I think that we can eliminate greenhouse gas emissions that we unnecessarily emitted in the past. So I think that this is an area that requires further study and analysis so that we can approach it in a more multi-dimensional way. Originally, I've asked each and every discussant to present for about 7 minutes. And now we're going to move on to a Q&A session so that I can also ask some questions. According to the program, we're supposed to have a Q&A session, and we have some people in the floor and also those watching from YouTube. So you can raise your questions, and we'll try to deliver those questions first, and then if we have more time, I will go ahead and ask my questions. Okay, so I think that I will actually do it the opposite way. I'm going to ask my questions to the 5 discussants and then ask for their answers. For Dr. Lee.
So you talked about the factors that we need to consider when we set our NDCs. You talked about 2 methods, bottom up and top down. And you talked about the rationale of the 2 methods and what needs to be considered in these 2 methods. In the bottom up method, according to your explanation, it seems that major countries have set their 2030 new NDCs, and you compared the level of major countries with Korea's to set the range for Korea. Generally speaking, we heard from Simon Petrie's presentation on UK. There is the equity principle, fair share, and this is an important principle in setting emission targets, and according to that target. So using 2017 as a base year, you need to consider that country's capabilities and capacity. And another important factor is historical responsibility. And such historical responsibility, if that is considered in setting Korea's NDCs, are there any problems or issues? And next to Ms. Jung.
As we raise our NDC targets, I think that impact can be felt by many different sectors, and one sector would be businesses that are subject to ETS. Because as we allocate emissions allowances, we would first look at NDC. So once we raise NDC to a more ambitious level, then that means the allowance that we can allocate to our Korean businesses can be gradually reduced and much more fastly reduced than what we have planned for. Therefore, I think that industries will be able to feel the fallouts from that. So if you know, Dr. John, please do share with us what sort of preparations the industries are making.
To Dr. Lee, as we go on to carbon neutrality, we need to have energy transition, and that is at the heart of net zero. And out of the energy transition, we need to expand renewable energy. Out of OECD countries, the renewable energy installation rate in Korea is the lowest of the OECD countries. So we have neglected this area up till now. Therefore, we need to expedite the expansion of renewable energy usage in Korea. We are seeing some adoption being rapidly taking place. However, if you compare with the NDC as that needs to be revised, there are some doubts on whether our renewable energy is enough. So we need to, it seems to be, to expand renewable energy. And for us to increase renewable energy, we need to change the citizens' mindsets, and there will be additional costs associated, which we have to burden. Meanwhile, we need to change laws and regulations on the legislation. What is most urgent? What needs to be changed urgently to increase adoption of renewable energy?
Now, for you, Mr. Jujin Kim, you talked about the case of Jeju Island. And you talked about the curtailment issue in Jeju and how KEPCO, the operator of the power system, is posing a lot of challenges. In my view, yes, KEPCO has a dominant role and dominant position in the power market, but at the same time, from the KEPCO's point of view, when it comes to running the power system, does it have any independence in operating the power system? I think that it will refute that because it's not really charging. When it comes to charging, the users of the power system, it doesn't have any independence to make its own decisions. So can we blame KEPCO for everything? And when it comes to renewables, yes, we've been seeing the rapid expansion of renewables, and that can also deal a blow to the power system. And power generated by the renewables, how are they going to be consumed? If we can't have any like data centers and heavy energy consumers in the neighborhoods, I think that that would be great. For certain regions, they're trying to host data centers, but the workers or the employees working at the data centers are resistant to work outside of Seoul in rural areas. So without any serious incentives. So yes, so we have some issues with KEPCO. And if we expand and roll out renewables, what would be the issues with our power system and how are we going to address that? Please do share that answer with us.
And to Eun-Bin-Gang. So you talked about your survival and that for the survival of youth, we need to quickly take action. I think that was your key message. And I think that everyone needs to take responsibility and we need to focus on this matter. And youth climate emergency action has criticized the policies of Korea thus far, and you need to do that, and we're grateful that you are doing those activities. And if we do address this issue with responsibility, for us to tackle global warming, Korea's efforts will not be enough because it is just 2% of greenhouse gases emitted, because US and China's emissions is half of global emissions. So in that sense, I know that the Youth Climate Emergency Action is working on progressing Korea's policies, but alongside such efforts, I think that various countries have youth organizations on climate. So I'm sure you're working with these other international organizations, and I wonder what activities you are doing with them. There were a lot of questions, and unfortunately, we cannot give you a lot of time. We can only give you 3 minutes. Let's hear from Dr. Lee first. So according to United Nations Framework for Climate Change, they have certain principles, and there are 3 principles. First is equity. So all human beings need to work on reducing emissions, and there's responsibility, common and differential responsibility. So those who have records and history of a lot of emission need to take more action, and respective capability. So countries that have more ability, they should make additional reductions. So there are these 3 principles. On the equity principle, all countries need to take action according to the requirements of IPCC. All countries need to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. So it means that developed countries should achieve net zero before 2050, and the developing countries can come on board later. So once again, according to this responsibility principle, Korea and developed countries need to achieve net zero by 2040 in order to achieve the 1.5 degree target. And the 2050 net zero target by major countries is based on the 2 degree target.
Dr. Chung? Yes, the ETS and also other matters, or NDC. I've been focusing my study on NDC, so I have limited insight into ETS. But I think that if we have a goal set, then I think that we have to have supporting policies. And we need to have incentives to lure more industries to come on board. And if you look at CBMA, yes, it has been postponed a little bit. However, I believe that it is going to be introduced eventually. So in response to that, I think that our industries need to start preparing. And many of the guidelines and the regulations that we see today actually in Korea benchmarked those of the European countries. And so I think that we have to actually tailor make our regulations and institutions to be more in line with the Korean industries. Thank you.
Compared to other countries, we are at the bottom of the list out of OECD countries on to renewable energy usage. I think it is because getting energy independence through renewable energy, we have not developed that concept yet. We're not sophisticated in this area. And we have energy plans, but energy plans were thought to be supplementary to economic policies and plans. And there's this concern about increased utility prices, and we do not have a consensus on this yet. And on the question of what needs to change first, to expand renewable energy, I think the first thing that we need is the space. We need to make adjustments to the laws to have space for renewable energy. So there has to be a buffer zone according to the law. So it has to be 1 kilometers from there. So it cannot be near roads and not near like houses, and you would have to go to mountains, and you cannot go to mountains. So this like buffer area required between the renewable energy production sites, it has to be changed. So we need to secure sites, and we need to have the grids. And this is something that the central government should work closely with the local governments. When developing nuclear power plants, the sites were determined by the central government, and the transmission also was determined by the central government. But wind farms and the power plants, rather the solar power panels, it's in the hands of the private sector. So there is this vicious cycle of not being able to find appropriate sites and making grids. And it's just like finding like oil fields and gas fields. And when I was young, it was a big dream for people to identify oil fields, and it's the same for renewable energy. It's as if you're finding an oil field, and it's required to maintain our economy, and it can lead to securing of jobs. So we should think of renewable energy on par with fuel security and energy security, and we need to find sites for this and set up the transmission lines. And the transmission lines, it's a separate story, but whichever report we read, for us to realize carbon neutrality, the most important area that requires funding, the urgent funding area, is about the power grid. And the second part is about energy efficiency and renewable energy. And on the renewable energy sites, the government came up with a site plan, but it was not accepted in the field, and that was an issue. But anyway, I think at the Energy Transition Forum, we need to discuss this matter to expand renewable energy. There are many barriers in renewable energy adoption, and we need to find ways to overcome these hurdles.
Next, I would like to invite Ju-jin Kim. Yes, not quite sure how I'm going to answer that question about data center, but anyways, the independence of KEPCO and the freedom. Now, yes, it's an important asset, and And I don't think that allowing private sector, private operators to build transmission and distribution lines is not going to be that easy. However, I don't think that dominance is not something acceptable either. Again, I think that if you look at countries with private sector involved in the power system, it's quite different. The network assets, we don't have any competition, and it's dominated by a single player. So it's a regulated asset. The asset is controlled by the government, and the access to the asset is decided by relevant laws and regulations. So these are some of the measures that were taken by key advanced countries like the United States and also European countries. I think that 2 weeks before EU Green Deals, expert talked about the second LNG package and the unbundling package. The unbundling package is about just separating the distribution and transmission operators. I think that KEPCO can operate the network, however, the system, however, it should not be dominating the asset. And I think that this can be detrimental to renewable energy. Again, KEPCO is going to side with the operators or the generators that will impact its bottom line. It's only human nature. So again, I would like to raise the issue of a conflict of interest. This dominated asset, regulated asset, doesn't really help to invite over many players, especially from the renewables sector, to free up this power system. So again, I think that there should be more equitable access to power system.
네. 우선 그
Next,
교수님께서
Invin. So the professor talked about Korea's emissions, that it only accounts for 2% of global emissions. However, that is just thinking about borders, and we should look at it from a larger picture. In 2019, globally, there were 100 companies that had the highest CO2 emissions, and fifth was 40th was Costco, and 58th was Samsung, and Hyundai Steel was ranked at 59th. And so these countries are not just operating in Korea, they are operating in various continents and other countries, and the climate activists and Koreans need to know about this, and therefore we need to make these companies be accountable. And if you consider the activities of these companies overseas, it's more than 2%. And Korea's influence is increasing, and I already mentioned this during my presentation. And Youth Climate Energy Action has been in operation for more than a year now, and one of our major agendas is preventing Korea from participating in overseas coal power plants, and Korean companies, what activities they are doing in Southeast Asian countries in coal power plants. This is something that we are seeing in Vietnam and Indonesia, and we need to tackle this issue, and we want to work on these overseas activities too, and this is one of our big plans.
Thank you very much. Are there any additional comments that our discussants would like to make? Yes, I see none. With that, I would like to close today's webinar. Again, I think that it was very informative to learn about the NDCs and key policies of many countries. And I concur with what Mr. Chang-Hun Lee said. UNFCCC early this year looked at the NDCs submitted by key countries around the world, and it actually published a report on the level of the NDCs. And compared to 2010 level, it turns out that the reduction is going to be less than 1%. Now, IPCC says that for us to realize 1.5 degree target, then we would have to reduce at least 45% compared to 2010. So 1% and 45%, you can see that there is a huge gap till recently. And as of today, we also learned about the NDCs of key countries and how they have been made more ambitious. Even if we take that into consideration, the revised NDCs, I think that still we have a wide gap to close. Therefore, when it comes to the issue of climate change, it's a life or death issue for us. And I think that we have to understand what the ideal goal is and the imperative goal is. Again, I think that these challenges are things that we see today because of all the pollutions and degradations that we have made in the past. So I think that we have to free ourselves and break away ourselves from the past mindset and try to be more innovative. And I think that those new open approaches is going to be critical in dealing with climate change. At the end of the day, everyone around us can be immune from climate change. We're all affected by climate change. Therefore, yes, we're talking about the topic of NDC, but when it comes to climate change, compared to other countries, I think that till recently, public understanding or public interest on the topic of NDC was quite limited. Therefore, I think that we have to have more active public discussion on the topic of NDC going forward and have it high on the national agenda. So with that, I would like to once again thank our 5 discussants and the speakers. Thank you and goodbye.